I am Sandy Sorensen, and I am the director of the United Church of Christ, Washington, D.C. Public Policy, Education, and Advocacy Office, and also a board member of CHSM. I have worked for and with all of these women in some way, shape, or form during my 30 years with the United Church of Christ national setting. On this stage this morning, we have the former executive director of the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, the former director of the Coordinating Center for Women of the United Church of Christ. We have an assistant UCC General Synod moderator. We have a public health professional. We have a registered nurse. On this stage are pastors, activists, community organizers, international feminist, womanist, mujerista leaders, writers, theologians, mothers, mentors, compañeras, seed planters, bridge builders, risk takers, light bearers, justice and witness together, women whose ministries are firmly and always have been planted at the intersections of oppressions. There are two last things I want to say about the women you will be about to hear from this morning. One is that I would not want to stand between any one of these women and justice. And the other is that honestly and truly to all of you, Traci, Bernice, Linda, and Loey, I would not be here without you.
Thank you, Sandy. The title for this plenary was inspired from a collection of essays compiled by womanist scholar of religion, Reverend Dr. Cheryl Townsend Gilkes, in a book with the same title. Dr. Gilkes was inspired by the popular folk saying, "If it wasn't for the women, you wouldn't have a church." Although data is not easily accessible in every category of leadership, it is clear that the leadership of women remains a persistent and consistent reality in both church and community. This morning, I have the privilege of moderating a panel of three of the women who have modeled exemplary leadership in our beloved United Church of Christ. I'm especially honored to serve as the moderator today because these are my predecessors in the national setting. I call them my aunties. They are also my role models and reminders that the work and the call never ends. We were scheduled to also be joined by Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk, but sadly the death of a dear friend caused her to have to cancel. She has written words that will hopefully be made available to all of you, and I'm certain that her spirit and her energy and her thoughts will be felt in our presence here today. I want to start with Reverend Dr. Bernice Powell Jackson, who was the Executive Minister of Justice and Witness Ministries from the creation of the post in 1999 until 2005. I'm then going to go to the other end to Loey Powell. Reverend Loey Powell began her national setting ministry in 1996 when she was called to serve as the last executive director of the Coordinating Center for Women in Church and Society. And finally, my immediate predecessor, Reverend Linda Jaramillo, was the executive minister of Justice and Witness Ministries from 2005 to 2015. No one can share a story better than the ones who lived it. So I want to begin this morning by acknowledging that all I've given you is their length of time in the national setting. Not the length of their witness, not the length of their service, not the length of their continuing legacy. We're going to start by asking each of you to share with us some of your story. What shaped you? What drives you? How did you end up here? Can we start with you, Linda?
Well, thank you. It's an amazing honor, and I'm really humbled at the opportunity to share with this group of witnesses whom I've admired for many, many years. And it won't surprise you to know that we keep in touch with each other. That's how we gather. That's how we come together as women. So let me begin with, I was born and raised in southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley. And I was born to Ezequiel Jaramillo and Luisa Jaramillo, who actually were community activists. Does that surprise you? They were very, very engaged in the life of their children because they had such a strong commitment to education. We were in a segregated society in southern Colorado and a segregated school system. Brown kids in one classroom, white kids in another. And my mother insisted that we be part of the whole school. So that's a part of what has really formed in terms of my own life and my own history. Now, we all moved to Oregon as a family when we were adults. It was before there were 500,000 Latinos in Oregon. So I got married and changed my name to Clark. And so I was Linda Clark. And as you can imagine, that created a different sense of privilege for me. And because I'm light complexioned, it really actually I got into places that I had not ever realized I could get into. That was that stunning realization of how assimilation works.
A part of that is there's such a duality of personality or persona that it just doesn't feel right. It just doesn't feel right. Something's wrong, and I didn't know what it was until I actually started working in the schools. I got on the school board, all that kind of stuff, and started interacting with families in different kinds of ways and seeing the repeat of the segregation and the denial of language and so forth.
And at that point in time, I decided, okay, I need to figure out my faith community, I need to figure out my professional community, I need to figure this out. And so I started looking for a church, and there was this UCC church in the middle of town that was providing migrant childcare to babies, 6 months to 6 years. They'd convert the whole building to a daycare center during the summer to take care of kids till they wouldn't go into the fields and be exposed to the toxins and all of the heat. So I saw that happening, and I said, wow, this is a church I want to think about. And so I did. I went to the church. It was the people in that church that I was really, really attracted to. As I started into my professional career, I got to direct that school years later, and it became Migrant Head Start. And I was directing a center that had originally been 75 babies, you can imagine 6 weeks to 6 years, to 600 kids, with about 300 staff throughout the summer. And I got to direct that program in the whole county and then moved into Oregon Regional Director. Then it was much later that I began my work in public health. So that's when I went to work for the public health department, where we really believed in social justice and inclusion and community wellness and community health. So I got to work in violence prevention and in HIV, AIDS prevention and intervention.
I was involved in social justice stuff as a community member. My mom was always an advocate. We were always advocates. We always learned it that way. But then I started thinking, when I was doing this cultural recovery, is starting realizing how I blend and weave my core values of equity and justice and fairness with my belief in God. And it was when that's when I started searching and found the UCC. I didn't know at the time, at first, that how advocacy driven the United Church of Christ is. I just knew that they were welcoming, that's all. So as time went on, I started learning more and more and more, and that's the infusion of the theology that came to me, and the learning about how that all is scripturally based, and how I say Jesus and justice, and the foundation of it all.
My first exposure to the wider church was Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk. When I was invited to go to a national convocation, I don't know the title, Bernice, you'll remember. It was the Convocation of Churches in Solidarity with Poor Women, or Women Who Are Poor. So it was in those days that I actually started thinking about the church. And because I believed the United Church of Christ when they said, we believe in the priesthood of all believers. I believed that. And I believed that the church was about extravagant welcome and creating change and changing lives. as well as continuing testimony. And so when I was in the middle of seminary is when I started seeing this sensing of call. And I actually received the call, wasn't elected yet, but received the call to come to Justice and Witness Ministries as executive minister when I was still in seminary. Coming from the Catholic Church, I got ordained because I could. I got ordained because I could.
God sent Jesus to try to help us figure it out and provide a modeling. And then I always believed in all the women who surrounded him. So some of the women who were part of his journey were intentional on his part. So that's what solidified it for me. And it was actually through my work in seminary and that kind of thing that I put the whole package together, and the power of the Holy Spirit to just really make you come alive. And that's why I really found that connection. And it is the source for me to do the social justice work.
The 4 values that I hold dear in my life, and those are the things that guide me, is the concept of encuentro. The concept of encuentro is the translation of encounter from English, but far deeper. It is relationship. It is that connecting with each other in deeper, stronger spiritual ways that we can't actually even realize or see. The second is solidaridad. It's solidarity, that we must never assume somebody else's life because we are the authors of our own story. That our solidarity is to accompany and to support and not to assume or assimilate someone else's life. And the third is justice is not political, it is theological. And I learned that from my sister here who said Jesus and justice belong in the same sentence. And my fourth is that hope. I have traded my sense of optimism for hope, because I believe that hope is what makes it possible. Søren Kierkegaard, old philosopher, said this. He said, hope is the passion for the possible. And so with that, that's where I find my sense of Jesus in my life and the resurrection and the hope that is brought to us. So that's that last piece is I do believe in hope. Because when you're doing this work, you really get discouraged from time to time. But if we have the encuentro, if we have the solidaridad, and we believe justice is theological, then we can have that hope.
Thank you, Linda. Can we go to you, Bernice? Tell us how you got here.
I kind of had thought of a different way of addressing this until Monday when we went to the Civil Rights Museum, and it made me think I need to start in a different place. I'm a Brown versus Board of Education baby. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. In 1954 on that wall, it said the first 2 cities that integrated schools in 1954 were Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And so I live in Tampa now. I serve as pastor of First United Church of Tampa. Do you know what year the schools in Tampa integrated? 1971. Anyway, I went to the first year of integrated schools in Washington, D.C. I was supposed to go to a black school, to Parkview Elementary School, and I went to an integrated school. I went to Petworth Elementary School. And on my very first day of kindergarten, standing in the playground, the first thing you learn how to do in kindergarten, you might remember, is learn how to line up to go in. And so our teacher called our names out and we lined up, and the little child in front of me turned around and said, "Are you white or are you a Negro?" And that was the very first day that I became aware of race and racism in America, on my first day of kindergarten. Because I didn't know the answer to that question. I just knew I was the daughter of and the sister of, and I had to go home and ask my mother, am I white or am I Negro? And my mother had to explain. So that kind of focused my life on that reality. As a young person, I was just all about doing justice, and I was angry all the time, by the racial injustice that I experienced and saw other people experience. And I didn't really think much about grace. As you get older, you learn something about grace and humility and things like that. And I think that that's one of the gifts that the church can bring to the larger justice movement, is that understanding of grace. We really can't have justice without grace, because we all have to understand that we're all a part of this messed up nation and in all of its many realities. And if it wasn't for the grace of God, this nation would not still exist. If it wasn't for the grace of God, black people wouldn't exist, because this country has done everything it could do in its history to eradicate us. My mother was from Virginia, about 35 miles from Washington, D.C. My mother only went to the 8th grade because there was no black high school anywhere near where she grew up. And so, like your mother, my mother instilled in me the importance of education because it had been denied to her. My father was a captain in the United States Army during World War II. It wasn't easy to be a black captain in the United States Army in World War II, but he was. And he died. He went to work one day and never came home. So that's a part of, all of that is a part of the reality that I have seen in my lifetime. It's not museum, it's life. And it's shaped who I am. I'm not optimistic about many things in the world, because I see certain things. I see us going back in many ways. And even though, many of us have worked so hard around a multitude of justice issues, the reality is that each generation has to be vigilant. Each generation cannot take for granted the progress that was made by people who came before them. They have to fight on their own, for their own, not so that A, we don't go backwards, but B, we keep going forwards. When I came to the United Church of Christ, I actually came as a consultant to the Commission for Racial Justice in 1982. And Charles Cobb was the executive director of the Commission for Racial Justice. He taught me a lot. And then I worked for Bishop Tutu for 3 or 4 years, which was an extraordinary opportunity to meet an extraordinary person, talk about justice and grace. During my time, both in CRJ and then with Justice and Witness, I met so many extraordinary women. People like Juanita Helfrey, who was on national staff for quite a few years, but even before that, she was like you, she was involved in the church. And though she told sacred stories about what it meant to be a Native American woman growing up on Fort Berthold Reservation. And so her stories became my stories. And when I met Linda, Linda's told me stories, sacred stories of growing up in her people, and those stories became my story. And so all these stories that I learned from Rose Lee about Chinese Congregational Church, from Ali Nabat about Puerto Rico, all those stories became my story, and it changed me, so that I was no longer the person who was the daughter of Bernice, and my mother's name was Bernice too, the Bernice and Otis Fletcher. I was the daughter of all these people and all these communities. And that to me has been such a gift from the United Church of Christ. We're never doing enough. And many of our churches are really engaged in doing justice and teaching justice to young people, and in allowing and helping their members to be a part of doing justice. But many of them are not. There's an urgency. And I don't think any of us can I don't care how old you are. I don't care how tired you are. I don't care how poor you are. I don't care how rich you are. I don't care what color you are. I don't care what gender or sexual identity you have or orientation you have or any of those things. If you don't feel a sense of urgency, then I don't think your pulse is moving. Because there's a lot of things that are very serious that are happening not just to our nation, but to the whole world. They're part of a movement in the whole world. And so I think those of us who do believe in the God of justice have got to continue to work until we no longer have breath.
I want to invite Loey into the conversation. So how did you get here, Loey?
I have a T-shirt that I wear a lot, so it's really worn out, and it's actually in my suitcase upstairs, that has a phrase on it that many of you have heard or probably know, which just reads, "Women who behave rarely make history." As a child, I did not behave. Yeah. I talked a lot in class and sent notes to my friends in grade school, and I got sent down to the principal's office a lot. And I think in part what I learned from that is there are norms, there are rules, there are traditions, there are all kinds of things that need to be challenged from time to time. They just don't make sense. They're not necessarily in the best interest of all of us. It's just the way that it always is.
Justice for me is as a person of faith, is a concept that we learn about through biblical study, through understanding what is the justice that God has envisioned for humanity, for all of us and for this earth. There are injustices in our justice system because in my understanding of justice, it is the equal application of law and rights to all of people, and we know throughout history that has not been the case. That the injustices many people experience because of the color of their skin, where they live, what language they speak, what their gender is, gender identity has been unjustly applied, not fairly applied.
So I did learn that, and I carried that with me and learned to question authority. Just question, why are we doing this? But it's a spirit I think I got certainly from my parents, both of whom were justice people in the core of their beings. My father was very active in the civil rights movement in the 60s in a white suburb of Chicago where he was senior minister of a church where I grew up. I had a mother who was a minister's wife, who was a very unconventional minister's wife. And I had parents who loved me when I came out as a lesbian. So I did not have the trauma that so many kids do and young people do when they come out to their families, of being cast out of the home, of being just disappeared in many ways. I had the grace of acceptance of my parents. I went to college in the 70s, it was 60s and 70s, participated in Vietnam War protests. Feminism was beginning to happen. Black pride was beginning to happen on the campus. I went to Oberlin College. All these things were there and happening. Kent State happened when I was there. So the justice stuff was all around us, and we learned to be activists. I learned to be an activist. I learned to take part in things and to protest. But I was also, in my soul, troubled, because at that point I did not really know who I was. And I took a year break between college and going to seminary. I went to Pacific School of Religion. I'd been accepted there. Went there sight unseen. It was all the way across the country in Berkeley, California. Linda's also a graduate from PSR. And it was when I went to seminary and fell in love with a woman that I realized who I was, and came out and realized, this is really fun. I am in Berkeley, California, the lesbian capital of the world. I am in a seminary that is accepting. I am in San Francisco Bay Area, which is about as gay as you can get. And so that was a gift, that was a grace of God to send me out there and not to some other place where me finding out who I was might have been much more problematic.
Grace is a gift of God that we don't ask for. We are simply offered it. The kind of grace that connects for me with justice and keeps me fueled is not something I can get on demand. But it happens, and the moments that it happens are sometimes very personal moments. It's like going into challenge the presumptions of a legislature that are trying to deny women's rights, and testifying and hearing from people who have a different opinion than you some pretty nasty things about who you are, what you're saying, you're a baby killer and all that. Doing that, which is hard, it takes hard work, and then going outside, and unbeknownst, you didn't ask for this eagle flies overhead. And I look at it and it's like, thank you. I needed that moment of grace, that moment to pause, to be reminded of something greater than just me, or anybody else who was in that room in that moment.
Spiritually for me, I turned from being a Maundy, Thursday person into an Easter person. I knew what new life was for the first time. I knew what resurrection was. I knew what was possible. And coming into myself and knowing that that is possible for every one of God's children helped so much, because we were in the Bay Area at a time when the AIDS crisis was new, when young men and women were dying, trans women were dying, and nobody was doing anything for them except for the women who began care organizations. And most of us were lesbians. We were often the ones who navigated those waters and created safe space. So I learned that. And it was part of it became part of my DNA. One day I received a call from Mary Susan Gast, who was the executive for the Coordinating Center for Women, who said, Loey, have you thought about applying for the executive director job at CCW? Because she had announced that she was leaving. I said, no, I haven't thought about that. Things are going really well here. And I did. I did apply. And thinking, oh, this is really smart. Apply for a job you know is going to end in 3 years because they're getting rid of the office. But yes, I did apply and then was engaged with CCW before working with first Bernice and then Linda in Justice and Witness Ministries. All of our movements have failed in varying parts of our times to truly understand intersectional justice, whether it's about issues of LGBTQ people, about misogyny, about male dominance, about class, race. And the gift I have learned in my working in the United Church of Christ is how it is we need to struggle and have the honest and authentic conversations with each other all of the time.
In response to that, because not having Mama Delk here is a great loss. When I got this position, for some reason I ended up in Atlanta with Mama Delk. And we were staying in the same hotel. There was no plan for us to spend time together other than this meeting we went to. And early one morning, the phone rang, and it was Mama Delk. And she said, do you have clothes on? And I said, yes. And she said, meet me in the lobby. And I went down to the lobby. If you know me, this won't surprise you. I had on 3-inch heels. And Mama Delk had on some tennis shoes. And I said, uh-oh. And she said, come go with me. And I said, okay, you want me to get a car? She said, no, we're walking. And I struggled to keep up with her, and she walked me to the church that she was first called to. And she took me into the basement of that church.
First Congregational.
And she told me the story of how no one would hire her, Loey. And that eventually this church called and gave her an assignment in the basement of the church.
Correct.
And the only way she got out of the basement was because someone that they had called for Women's Day as a speaker, they were so busy trying to be important, don't tell them I said that, that they forgot to schedule someone to pick up the speaker from the airport. And the speaker flew back home. And so it was Women's Day, and Yvonne got a call from the pastor upstairs to come out of the basement to preach this Women's Day. And she looked at me in that basement and said, the reason I'm telling you the story is because your job is to be ready when the call comes.
Yeah.
That's who she is.
Yep.
And I honor her here.
You know, we used to sing a song in our church asking the question, is it well with your soul? Is it well with your soul? And it's been clear for a long time that there are a number of things that are creating in the land that we live illness. Illness that touches our minds, illness that touches our bodies, illnesses that touches our spirits. And those illnesses come from personal realities that we find ourselves dealing with, and it comes from systemic issues that we find ourselves dealing with. And when we ask what is health, what does it mean to have a sense of well-being in your mind, in your spirit, in your body? What does it mean for you to feel that all is well with you in the midst of the life that you have been given? And we've got to say that in our land, that there have been many viruses. The coronavirus right now has attacked our bodies, and the toll that it has taken is immensely. But we have other viruses that have been in existence for quite some time. Anything that takes life, anything that demeans life, diminishes life, is an illness, is a virus. And so we live in a world where racism is a virus, where sexism is a virus, where heterosexism and classism are all viruses that attacks the mind, the spirit of people. And certain persons in our communities, in our churches, in our life. And CHSM being challenged with the goal of trying to bring healing and hope in the midst of viruses has a major challenge that connects to the time in which we now live. The institutions that are there, they minister out of a faith-based context. So they are not only ministering to the disease that's in the body, but it's also helping persons to develop a sense of well-being, mind, body, and soul and spirit. It takes place in faith. It takes place in the context of community. It takes place in the context of covenant, that we exist together for each other. And it means it has to function at two levels. At that personal level, where we are able to come to those places which will bring healing and hope to our bodies, and at the same time address systemic issues which block. At a time when folk were not able to have health care, we had the church offering health care. At a time in which we had persons who were children who didn't have access to the healing that they needed in the context of care. We had CHSM working with youth and children ministries. We had CHSM working to offer health, healing, and wholeness and connection in the midst of the viruses that have attacked, I would say, our bodies, minds, and spirits. And so for me, you are very much connected at the time in which we live. And what's happening right now is that the virus is unearthing the injustices that have existed for quite some time. It's not surprising that African Americans are dying at a higher rate because African Americans have had to suffer the injustices of not having adequate health care, the injustices of having to work in places where their bodies, minds, and spirits have been exposed to toxic conditions. They suffer from having to try to be whole in a land that is pressed back against them. So physically, mentally, emotionally, they have been in a place where it has not been well. And when a virus like this attacks that body, that mind, and spirit, it unearths it in a very real kind of way. The injustices, systemic injustices, has a deep impact on our bodies, on our minds, and our spirits. And so to have CHHSM in the midst of this, looking at the intersection of justice and grace at a time, it is so amazing to me that you all went to Memphis, which was the last place that Dr. King was when he was struggling to stand side of the garbage workers who were struggling for dignity at that time. He had taken the gospel to the places where there was hurt and pain. And that's what CHHSM does. It takes its ministry of health, healing, and wholeness into those places where there's hurt, where there's healing, and where there is pain. And out of it, we have to ask ourselves the question now, how do we minister now in the midst of this moment where, one, people are dying, where, number two, the whole economic system has been turned upside down, so people are hurting economically, where people are being in a place where they're searching for meaning, where even we've had to come out of the cathedrals we built. We've had to come out of our churches and come into a different way for us to be connected one to the other. So is it well with our souls? Is it well with our nation? Is it well? No, it's not well because the viruses are there. But there are instruments of wholeness. There are instruments of justice. There are faith-based affirmations and institutions that keep reaching into the midst of that, trying to create that wholeness that we need.
What Linda and Bernice and Loey and Yvonne have been for me is a safety net. Is just very different because I wasn't reared in the United Church of Christ when I did my acceptance speech, my first acceptance speech. But I called the names of women who I'd been watching in this denomination, names of women that I knew had served in various roles. And it was on those women that I thought I was accountable and that I was looking forward to being mentored by and shaped by, and none of them have disappointed. And I include in that list people who were not on that panel, people like Edith Guffey, people like DeVita, who I can pick up a phone and say, I'm wrestling with something, or I'm wavering on something, or is this, am I thinking about this correctly? And every one of them answers. So for me, they have become that cloud, right? They're not the cloud that's gone away, but I feel like there's a cloud of witnesses that hold me responsible, hold me accountable, but also nurture me and encourage me and sometimes correct me. And I'm grateful for all of that. We have a ministry that is larger than we believe. And I believe that while we are very impactful in the things that we do, we're very impactful in the justice actions that we are part of. We do major mainline things, and you may see my face everywhere. The power of the United Church of Christ is that in these places all over, we are the church scattered with even more power than we are as the church gathered. And I believe that if we can tap into that story, that it will blow your mind what we'll be able to accomplish. Towards justice, moving from inclusion to belonging. Towards prophetic witness, where we boldly declare that there is no human being that God doesn't fully love just as they are. To amplifying the public witnesses we've had with people who stand on the margins, not as savior, but as companion. I pray that that's a part of my legacy, that I amplify this ministry that the United Church of Christ has as a treasure. That's what I want to do. I would like for you all to know that in our time together, we all went to lunch together. Was that yesterday? It seems like last week. We all went to lunch yesterday. And what I journaled about that meeting with these phenomenal women is their commitment to the full visualization of all women. Recognizing that, yes, we're on this stage because it was easy to do the categories, but that all women make a difference.
Absolutely.
And not only am I saying that just because there are women in this room, but to dispel the myth that there is actually some front line that you get to go to. There is no front line. There's only a decision to show up fully as you are. And if you show up, opportunities to serve will be all around you. That's what I learned from them, that they're no longer at the national setting, but I can and do call all of them. For we don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to always be the one that's right. We don't always have to be the one that's in front. We are stronger because women get that we are better together than we are apart.
That's right.
Thank you.